Hello! Welcome to Why Not Both, the podcast all about how our multiple passions and interests shape our identity and our lives. My name is Pam Schaefer, and I am a musician and therapist in Los Angeles, and I also happen to be your host. This podcast is produced by Laura Studeris, and for this season, we've partnered up with Under the Radar magazine. If you like what you hear, you can hang out with us on social media. We are on Twitter and Instagram at WNB the podcast. And if you really, really like what you hear, please support us on Patreon. We are under Why Not Both podcast. When you join our Patreon, you get a whole bunch of really cool behind the scenes stuff and you get to chat with us. And that's pretty awesome. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy our interviews. For this episode, we got to chat with Davies, aka the Anchoress. We got to talk all about her new album that just is coming out now, and her work as a producer, and her work as a writer, and a touring member of Simple Minds. She basically kind of does it all. It's not why not both, it's more like why not do everything. I hope that you enjoy our chat. Welcome to Why Not Both.
Thank you for having me.
We are here with Catherine, and I'm very excited to be talking to you because it's been quite a while.
I know, I'm terrible. I was juggling so many things that this is my excuse. The conversation about why not both, why not everything, and then we will never speak.
Exactly. And I started the podcast and I'm like, haha, an excuse to talk to all of my friends about all of the things that they do.
And all of the reasons why they haven't called you lately.
Exactly. It's like there is that meme about like that adulthood is essentially being like, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. Do you want to have coffee? Yeah, I'm free on Tuesday. Oh, I'm not free on Tuesday. And then that cycle just completes until the end.
I think that's the great thing about kind of modern technology though, isn't it? Because you can still have that communication without having to schedule in necessarily a face-to-face, which
Exactly.
I find really, really difficult to prioritize because I'm such a workaholic.
Yes. Whenever people are like, oh, do you want to hang out? I'm like, this is maybe an LA thing. Sometimes I'm like, do you want to co-work? Like, do you want to be on our laptops not speaking, but in the same physical space?
No, I don't think that's an LA thing unless I have co-opted that without realizing. I think that's just a hyper-focused kind of highly what's the word I'm thinking of when you're very attuned to just the end product.
Yes. Goal driven.
Yeah, I think so. I have a lot of anxiety about doing things that don't necessarily have an end outcome, which I know is terribly unhealthy, but at least I recognize it. Step one.
There we go. You're like, the first step is recognizing you have a problem with productivity.
The second step is never doing anything about it.
I was like, somewhere in there you apologize to someone and then just keep working on your projects. So I guess that leads into the question of like, what do you do? And is there a better question to ask than what do you do?
Well, I guess kind of the main thing that people probably know me for is my musical projects, which is the Anchoress, which is a sort of alter ego moniker in the vein of, I guess, St. Vincent, etc. I didn't want to use my given name for my project because I wanted to have a little bit of distance between myself and the work that I put out there. So most people will know me for the music that I make as the Anchoress, and a lot of those people will know me through the collaborative work that I've done with Manic Street Preachers, although I know that's not such a big thing over in the States. They've never kind of broken through in the same way that they have over here, but I work with those guys a lot. And then I've also, for the last 5 years, was a member of Simple Minds, and kind of sort of traveled the world with them. So I was juggling that with my own music at the same time.
Oh my goodness.
And then before that, I did my PhD in literature and wrote a book, and that's sort of been a kind of less prominent, I guess, thread over the last 5 years, just because there are only so many hours of the day.
Right.
But since I stopped touring with Simple Minds last summer, that's certainly something that's come to the fore again. And I think that's really nice about, so I guess what the theme of the podcast is why not both, or rather why not something. Both suggests only two options, and two is not enough to keep my brain satisfied.
True, but it was very catchy, right?
But it's the way I think that things take prominence at different points in your life, and that's certainly been the case with my quote unquote career so far, and that there'll be points in the year where something is completely taking over, and then the other 2 or 3 things that I'm doing might just fall back for 6 months or 8 months or a year or whatever. So it's just the, different things kind of taking prominence at different moments.
I was going to say, I'm really curious, now that you had written the PhD, is it that what are you doing in the sphere of academia now that you aren't touring, that you said that kind of had a resurgence? I was like, are you doing a postdoctorate or what? I was like, what happened there?
Well, I'm actually teaching 1 day a week, which is something I never envisaged going back to. But I'm teaching on a master's program, partly because I, for many complicated reasons, couldn't see touring for 9 months of the year as a sustainable way of living if I wanted to have any kind of balance in my life.
Right.
And I'm really lucky and really privileged that I have that kind of education and qualification to fall back on, because obviously I need only work that 1 day a week in order to make enough money to make it feasible to be creative the rest of the time. And I'm enormously educationally privileged to do that. But that was always kind of part of the game plan. In that even just doing the PhD enabled me to make my first album, because I couldn't have afforded to have done that had I not been being paid to do my PhD, which again is a very unusual situation to be in here, to get a research grant, to get a scholarship, to do that. But I've always kind of juggled things hand in hand. One has always fed into the other. So the PhD enabled me to start making music in the first place.
And that's so fascinating, because a lot of people I've spoken to in the US and then in other countries about this relation of what people perceive as a day job, and that people have shame around having a day job as opposed to not making money from music. But it sounds like for you, you got to use a passion in your day job that then funded your music.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was so programmatic that I planned it, but it was sort of a case of, I did my first degree and then I got a scholarship to do my master's, and then got offered the opportunity to do my PhD, and I was going to move up to Cambridge to follow my supervisor there. But then ended up realizing that I could take this money that they were offering me and stay in London and kind of put together a musical project at the same time. And thought, well, I can either go get a job and work 5 days a week, or I can really, focus on the PhD and probably, maybe work 2 days a week on it, and the rest of the time be doing music and be getting paid for that. So it just sort of seemed like a no-brainer for me. In a world and in an industry, I think, that really favors people who come from moneyed backgrounds, which I don't at all. It was the only way for me to make music. It wasn't possible for me to do that otherwise.
Well, because you produced the first album as well, right?
I co-produced the first album, yeah.
Amazing.
And again, that was something that I could only do being time rich. And that was what the PhD kind of allowed for me, was that time richness, that sense of having the space to think about things, having the time to be creative. And I think that's so difficult if you have a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah, because then mentally, I mean, even if a job isn't that mentally taxing, you are still present at a job. Or at least I'd hope you are, like when you're there. And so it does use some of your bandwidth, that then when you get home, it's like, okay, you might need kind of like a recovery period and then work on something creative.
Yeah, I mean, even fast forwarding 4 years on from that to when I was touring super heavily with Simple Minds and trying to make the second record at the same time, I would have, my mini kind of studio set up with me, that I would be working on planes, I'd be working in airport lounges, I'd be working in hotels. But there are limits to what you can do.
Yes.
Both in terms of the practicalities of what you can take with you, but also your bandwidth, your mental bandwidth, when you're focused on this other very demanding, very kind of energy zapping job. It's people think, oh, you just pop on stage for 3 hours each night, but it's so much more than that.
Well, yeah, that concept of time richness that you brought up too, like I can't imagine getting into really deep focus on something that you were producing while you're in like an airport lounge after maybe the night before being on stage for 3 hours.
No, I mean, what I would do is I would stack up loads of kind of editing work or comping work, as I call it. So in any of the gaps that I had kind of in between legs of tours or whatever, I would just accumulate a whole load of recorded material that I then wanted to sift through and edit. There were occasions when I would kind of demo vocals who do rough vocals, or people would be sending me stuff to kind of import into sessions, and I'd work on it if we had like a day off or something. But on the whole, it was a lot of editing work.
Oh my goodness, that's to be honest, that's my least favorite part of working on my own production. Is I'm like, I recorded all these wonderful vocal tracks, and I was like, I have to sort through all of these vocal tracks.
No, it's my favorite thing. See, this is why I love production. Absolutely, my favorite thing is getting so fully immersed in a task like that hyper focus that you have.
That is so funny. I love the recording part, and then I guess it's mainly my vocals that I hate editing. I'll edit other things that I recorded, but hearing my own voice that much after a while, I'm like, are you still singing, Pam?
I think you have to kind of evolve. If you're working with your own voice, you kind of evolve a certain detachment over the years. And I guess I'm just so used to it now. I'm just like, yeah, that's shit. I really enjoy the process. I can just be objective about it.
That's so interesting. I think I might err on the side of I'm very hard on myself during vocal takes.
You have to think of yourself as another person though when you're kind of assessing and editing together a vocal. It's not you. You have to dissociate. That would be my big tip. But I think it's always been like that. It's always been, I didn't really ever want to be a performing artist. I wanted to make records.
And then you ended up on a Simple Minds tour.
Yeah.
What happened?
That's a long story. How did that happen? Well, I was co-writing on for another project called The Dark Flowers, working with a producer and writer, Paul Statham. He's an amazing songwriter. He's worked with everyone from Kylie to Dido. He's a really big pop writer, and he had this kind of project. We've just actually finished a second record for this too, where I've co-written 5 songs with him for that. And it's a dark country project.
Ooh.
Utterly bizarre, but I had written, as I say, a couple of songs for this project with him. And then Jim Kerr from Simple Minds had heard, because he was also involved in this, it was a kind of big supergroup project. It was like Pete Murphy from Bauhaus, Kate Havlicek, Shelley Paul from Alicia's Attic. There was so many great people involved in it. And he just happened to hear the tracks that I'd co-written. And I think he saw a little video of me kind of messing around with Paul Statham that we'd recorded. And then I sort of got a phone call basically saying, what are your plans for next year? Because when you're talking a tour that's this big, it's planned kind of 18 months in advance,
right?
I would say. And it just kind of spiraled from there. We met for breakfast one day, had a chat. It was all very kind of non-committal at that point. It was like, let's get in a room and play and see how it feels. And I'd never done anything like that before. I think my dad had just died. It was a really odd time in my life. I think normally I would have straight away have gone, oh God, no, I hate traveling. I'm not going to do that. But I was very much in the kind of saying yes to things. Life is really short.
Right.
And then the next 4 years basically spent taking more planes than anyone who has a ridiculous fear of flying should take. Which culminated in an Australian tour where we would be taking a plane sometimes twice a day.
Oh my God. Yeah, because Australia is huge and everything's very dispersed.
I mean, by the end of it, I just had no fear of flying at all. It was just like getting on a train for me.
There you go, desensitization.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot of air miles. A lot of air miles.
Gosh. So how many tours did you end up going on if it was over 4 years?
So we did, the first one was quite a long stretch, and that was sort of I was up in Glasgow from the December of the previous year, and then I think we ended up going right through to the end of May. So it's about 5 months. And then
wow.
we had summer dates. And then I think we did an arena tour the year after that was much shorter, because obviously the bigger the shows, the shorter the tours are. And I'm trying to think. I think it was about 4 tours in the end. Sometimes they just kind of meld into each other, like you'll be doing a European tour and then that will kind of melt into sort of summer festival dates.
Oh
So
my
it's
God.
hard to say where one kind of ends and one begins. But the last year that I did with them was, it just got so crazy because I was juggling so many things. I was playing with the Manic Street Preachers. I think I did a show at Wembley Arena.
Oh my God.
They drove me straight to the airport. I flew straight to Slovenia, where I then did a show with Simple Minds, flew straight back, did mad things like had a show in Manchester with Simple Minds, got up at 5 a.m. to get a train down to London to make a video with the Manics, to then do a show in the evening at the Roundhouse with Simple Minds. And it all just started to be a case of, this is too much for one person to physically do.
That's what I was wondering, is that I was like, that sounds genuinely exhausting.
I mean, even just one of them would be exhausting, I think.
Yes.
But obviously when you're being offered these incredible opportunities, both for your own music, but also being a part of something amazing and learning so much from these guys, it's very hard to say. Well, you don't say no, you don't want to say no.
Of course. I just imagined you being kind of like shuttled about like a little doll. Just like, here you go, fwing.
I think I was fairly physically broken by the end of it. I'd forgotten how to sleep. And no one really talks about the realities of that. I think we all kind of hush it up because, you know, obviously there are so many amazing aspects of touring and that life. And, you know, I'm so super grateful to have been offered the opportunity. But at the same time, that does not erase the very real physical and mental toll that takes on you when you are doing 6 shows a week in 5 different countries.
It sounds like magically disorienting to me.
Yeah, I think it has a huge effect on your brain chemicals. It took me a long time to come down from that in terms of adjusting to normal life. You know, it had a huge impact on my life as well. You know, I think when it's a man touring, perhaps there is a little bit more understanding that, you know, a guy will go off and travel for his work, etc. But
right,
there's perhaps more cultural pressure, I think, to be present and more at home. I mean, it got to the point where I hadn't cooked for 4 years at one point.
I have no such excuse as touring. I'm like, what is cooking?
I bought a house, I think, a couple of months before I left for the first tour, and it was so ridiculous. Like, I think I used the cooker twice in 4 years. And I see it time and time again, the casualties of, you know, even just, I say even, you know, for the crew as well. They're in exactly the same situation, leaving families behind, etc.
Well, go on.
I think there is a reason why crews are predominantly male. You don't get a lot of women on the road. I think there are bigger questions about, you know, what we're prepared to put up with, what we're prepared to sacrifice, I guess.
Well, and that's interesting that structurally, because it makes sense in some ways that it's like the same crew the whole time, because then everybody knows what they're doing. You end up developing a good team. And I was like, I wonder if in some ways it could be because the band members you can't shift out a band member, but it's like almost if the crews could work on shifts in different places.
Oh yeah, the crew works so much harder than the band. They're doing crazy long days. Sometimes, you know, 18, 19, 20-hour days. I have enormous admiration for what they do. It's insane. Absolutely insane.
Wow.
I guess we're sort of talking in a way about the two extremes. If we think about the theme of the podcast, is that we're talking about jobs that are so all-consuming that they leave no space for anything else, and then also trying to juggle several of those jobs that are all-consuming. It's like, in hindsight, Catherine, why do you think that didn't quite work out?
You're like, hold up, I think I might have played myself.
Yeah, I regret none of it. I think, you know, it's so important to kind of take opportunities and try things and try different ways of living. And, you know, I have a lot of great experiences, and I've seen, well, I actually haven't seen many countries. I've traveled to many countries.
I was technically there.
Seen nothing. I mean, it's bad when you fly to Milan and you don't even like leave your hotel. You haven't got time. So
well, and I'd also imagine sometimes you're eating, like I was thinking about that, like being on tour, that you're eating odd foods, sleeping at weird times. Like the only consistency then really probably would be being on stage. Like at least that's reliable.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You've nailed it. The show is the highlight of the day, not only because it's the show, but also because it's that consistent moment where you know what to expect.
Yes.
And you know what's expected of you as well.
Yes, you're like, okay, I know this bit. This is
yeah, and I love being on stage with those guys. It's just that made it all just worth it. All of the not sleeping, all of the traveling and being in planes and not wanting to be in planes, and
once you're on stage you're like, okay. Well, I loved seeing live photos of you from that time, because you look genuinely like so happy.
It's all the PVC.
How could you not be happy being glam in PVC?
Well, what other job is where the uniform is PVC? Let's not ponder that. There are some.
Yeah. I was like, wait, I know the answer to this one.
Maybe this is the next part of the podcast.
Exactly. And for your fourth career.
Well, it has been suggested.
That's hilarious.
I am quite bossy.
Oh my gosh. Well, that makes you a good producer in a way. Like, you know what you want. You know how to get there.
That's a nice segue. Yeah, I mean, and that has, and obviously coming off tour has enabled me to focus much more on, the production and going back into the studio and working with other artists and bands, which is, where I started and what I genuinely love doing. And I just see life as a kind of evolving, unraveling ball of wool, and it's like, this is the next bit of focus for me, and I don't know, how long that will last, and maybe I'll go back out on the road again in a couple of years, but for the moment, I want to be more, based in one location, a bit more static for a while.
Yeah. Well, and especially I liked what you said about that you're kind of back where you wanted to be in, because I thought of, your work with the Manics and your work with Simple Minds, it is kind of like bringing someone else's vision to life. But when you're in the studio as a producer for someone else, like, what is that like to kind of bring their vision to life? I
mean, I just find that endlessly rewarding. I think that's probably why I like also collaborating on stage with other bands as well. It's really nice to have the pressure taken off of you, where when you're an artist in your own right as well, I think there's a lot of, and you have that single focus and everything's on your shoulders. It's just really lovely to work with other people on their projects, bringing their vision to life, because it's not just all about you. And unless you're a massive narcissist, none of us wants to spend all of our time thinking about ourselves. Well, I certainly don't.
I don't. I feel, though I quite like my own company, after a while I'm like, okay, this is a closed loop.
Exactly. And it's just nice, even from on that social aspect, just working with other people as well, having someone else in the studio, just having a different point of view. And there's nothing that I like better than finding myself at the end of the day realizing how much I've learned from working with someone I've worked with before, especially if it's one of the kind of younger songwriters coming in, and just feeling like really inspired by this kind of different perspective that I hadn't thought about before. Or they might be playing me some artists that I've not heard of. Shock horror, I don't know everything. That's just really, really great. And that kind of brings me back around to a point that you made earlier about this kind of almost shame that people have. If you don't make enough money from this one single thing, then you're considered a failure. But I just think there's so much value to be had in constantly not only broadening your horizons from that single focus, say that traditionally one would be thought of as a success if you made enough money from your one artist project, but what you're doing is really limiting yourself in terms of your creative growth too, because you're not inviting any new influences into that sphere naturally. when
Mm-hmm.
you're working with that, because I'm recording other artists, co-writing for other artists or other projects, I'm constantly nourishing and feeding this side of myself that was what led me to want to create in the first place. And I think that a lot of artists kind of fall into that trap of they get writer's block because they don't realize that you've got to keep feeding the beast.
That makes complete sense. And I think that's really beautiful that in a way that you pointed out that you're learning, it sounds like also a lot of other people are learning from you, but through the process, you're learning through them as well. Like you're enriching their work and therefore enriching then what you end up producing.
Well, if you think about when we're teenagers, it's a very natural state to be in. We're like sponges. We're absorbing all this new music for the first time, listening to all these influences that will become foundational to what we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you stop doing that the moment that you get any kind of success, or you stop exposing yourself to, different perspectives. And I've just found that to be a really great accidental side benefit of the production work and the songwriting work.
That's
is that
amazing.
I'm constantly just going, oh my god, that's great, I hadn't heard that, that's brilliant. I'm gonna basically, it's like I'm magpie-ing from all of these different people. They don't realize this, but they do realize this. But that's what being creative is. If you look at all of my favorite artists like Bowie, Kate Bush, etc., there's a lot of magpie-ing going on. I like that.
I like that you just made magpie a verb.
Yeah, it's my new verb. There's a lot of the magpie-ing. Some people can kind of cast it as plagiarism, etc., or drawing influence from cultures or artists that they've not originated the idea. But I just think, we live in a postmodern world, and that to me is an integral part of the process. I don't see that as problematic.
I was gonna say, I guess if we were, jettisoned back several thousand years, then it might be a good idea to think of some original ideas. But at this point in time, there's so many ideas germinating everywhere. It's like, how do you define even an idea as like being like, oh, this is a singular original idea?
Exactly. I've had some interesting conversations with people about the band, the 1975, and I know I'm not their target demographic. They're one of my favorite bands at the moment, and a lot of the arguments against them that you'll hear from people who are slightly older, music journalists, etc., is like, they're really derivative, this is in excess, this bit is Prince, this is Scritti Politti or whatever. And it's almost like this kind of difference in mindset about what constitutes originality. And to me, they're melding all these things together. A whole new generation of teenagers that have no fucking clue who Scritti Politti are. or haven't, or in excess, and all of and I just find it quite depressing that they're being kind of denigrated for doing essentially what the Beatles did.
Right.
Which again is that we're back to the magpie-ing again.
There's value to be had when you can actually collate older things into a new thing that people are really excited about.
Exactly, and at the end of the day, the proof is in, is it a great song?
Right.
Is it an exciting song? And I think that what they're doing is probably the most interesting thing that any band is doing currently.
I feel that way of who was it? There's a music journalist that like shamed Billie Eilish for not knowing who, I think it was Van Halen. I was just like, I feel like it was definitely in that genre of that an interviewer was annoyed that she didn't know who they were, and I was like, what? Why would she? Like, why?
I'm not even sure that I've heard any Van Halen.
Yeah, I was just like, why would she? And also, why would a younger artist have to know this catalog? And how would they know that catalog? And why is it relevant? If they're making good music, like, why would you have to be like, oh no, you don't know every single band that existed?
No, although I do encourage my students certainly to try and, I guess this is where the PhD kind of comes in. It's like that kind of research focused approach to being creative. If you look at all the great authors, it's very unlikely that I can think of anybody that hasn't written something impeccable, that hasn't taken that approach of studying the genealogy, studying the greats, studying the classics. I guess I must have somehow transposed that onto my approach to music, and that yes, I did feel like it was my duty to go back and listen to, Patti Smith, Bowie, Kate Bush, the Beatles, to explore the cast, like the classics, penguin classics of music, essentially.
Did that inform you as the anchoress, or did that inform like just in general?
I think in general, really, it's just that idea of, if you want to be good at something, you need to study those that have been good at it before.
Gotcha.
So it's, the same as literature. If you want to be a great writer, you've got to go back and read and study the great literature.
Well, and it's interesting. I was talking to someone else about the philosophy of learning and then unlearning. It's almost like you have to go through and learn all of that stuff, but then while you're creating, if that's too much in the forefront of your mind, it might actually kind of dampen your creativity. So in some ways you have to then toss it out while you're doing it. Yeah, and then in the editing process, put it back in.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. It's like, know it all and then forget about it, and then try and be spontaneous, but know that is in your grounding and your foundations subconsciously.
Yes. Yes. And how do people find you, like in regards to co-writing and production and things like that?
I mean, it's all sorts of different routes, really. Sometimes I'll approach people that I think are really interesting and I want to work with. So there's an artist at the moment that I approached. She had split with her band, band that she was with, and I knew that she wanted to do some solo stuff. I sent her a track that I was kind of half finished and said, like, I think this could really work for you if you'd be interested in kind of writing something, a top line over the top of it. What do you think? And then she came in for a day and it really works. Nice. So yeah, sometimes it will be a bit kind of like I kind of stalk them on Twitter. Because honestly, I want to work with people that inspire and inspire me and challenge me. I think particularly for me, I wanted to work with other women in the industry because I feel that there's a real lack of safe spaces. And you hear a lot about bad experiences with producers, etc. And obviously something I can bring to the table, as well as my technical abilities, is that kind of empathy to know what it's like to be the only woman in the room. But I haven't exclusively just worked with women. Sometimes people, as I say, for the co-writing, people have approached me, like with Paul Statham and the Dark Flowers projects. It's all quite organic usually. There's lots of different kind of routes into working with me, but I think for a lot of people it's just about them knowing that I'm there and available, because they might know me more prominently as, oh, you're the person that duetted with the Manics, or you're in Mine, and they won't know what I do production wise.
Right. And so they might think that you're on tour all the time and you're like, wait, surprise, I'm back to being a studio rat.
Yeah, so I part of I think what will happen over the next few years is just making that kind of more prominent part of what people know me for, and that takes time. I understand that you've got to kind of earn your stripes.
Well, and I like what you said of providing a safe space, because it's true that being the only woman in the room ranges anywhere from awkward to dangerous. But I have also heard from non-binary and male artists that working with female producers is very different, because we probably have had that experience of being anywhere from awkward to dangerous. So we really foster having a safe space in the studio.
Yeah, and I don't want to make that necessarily like a USP, but I hope that is an attraction for people, and if they were thinking about working with me, as well as my what I've done before and the success that it's had, hopefully.
Exactly. I worked recently with another friend of mine, and she was doing the vocal production on a song that I was working on, and she had set up the studio with like little fairy lights and a color scheme and all of this stuff. Like, she took a photo of me in kind of the middle of what she'd made, like she'd essentially set designed for me to record.
Well, and it's so important though, isn't it, to kind of, I think that something that the best producers understand is that it's 90% psychology.
Yes, she made me feel so happy. I just moved in my chair. But she made me feel so happy and so at ease that then, like, I tracked the vocals super fast. And then, I mean, obviously I came to her because her vocal editing work is phenomenal and just flawless. But I felt so good tracking there that she was like, oh, well, you just made my job easier. And I was like, well, you made my job really easy and really lovely. Can I move in?
But also paradoxically, you can want to work the other way too, depending upon what the topic of the song is. And I've certainly been in situations where if it's, you want to cultivate a kind of, it sounds terribly sadistic, but if you want to cultivate a kind of mood of anger or whatever the kind of lyrical focus is, you might want to get an artist to talk about something that's quite difficult and uncomfortable that they've experienced, and then get them into that psychological headspace too. So I think it's just about, it's a little bit kind of method acting, isn't it, to some extent?
Well, yeah, because if you are acting in the song, if someone is, I guess, like, in some ways, some people are better actors than others, because like, how do you access that emotion that sparked the song in the first place?
Well, this is why I say it's 90% psychology. I think as a producer as well, especially if you're working on a project long term, part of your job is to kind of almost, it'd be like a midwife, isn't it? In terms of bringing it into the world, and knowing that there's going to be that tricky phase where the band or the artist is going to be like, do you know what, I don't want to do this anymore, I can't do it. There's always that point in the project where you're like, this is shit, and having the experience and the wisdom to work through that moment, and knowing what to say to people when you can see that they're visibly tired, knowing when to make people take breaks, get some food, really basic stuff that when you point it out is so obvious, but isn't always, I can tell you, that obvious in some of the working studios that I've been in.
Yes. And when you were speaking, I had it in the back of my mind that I thought, well, what do you do when you're the producer for yourself? How do you know when to push yourself and when to be like, oh, hold up, I think I need to actually have a biscuit?
I think that is more difficult. I mean, I finished my second record not that long ago as the sole producer, and that was a very different experience in that I had to rely so much on my own judgment. And I did go to outside mixers for the mixing stage because I needed that second pair of ears. So I was so lucky to work with David Ringer, who produced and mixed most of the Mannix records, and also Mariam McNulty, who's worked with Bowie for years.
Wow.
And that was invaluable because I knew them both pretty well personally, and I trusted their ears, and I trusted that they would tell me if I needed to go back and redo anything.
Right.
Because there was a point in the project where I lost confidence in myself, because it's very hard when you're in a hall of mirrors and you've got nobody else kind of bolstering you, and no one to bounce off, really.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because I encounter that when I'm producing my own work, is that there's always a point in a song where I just go, what the hell am I doing? I'm just kind of looking around like, there's no one else here. I have no idea if this sounds good or bad. Is this a mess? I don't know.
Well, I think it's about trusting your own judgment, isn't it? And that's an accumulation of confidence that happens over time, but also maybe having some informal kind of people that you can play things to, and knowing that that doesn't demand a production credit. MP3, unless it's a man that walks into a room. There's that famous Lana Del Rey quote, isn't there? It's like a man walks into a room and suddenly he's got 30% of the publishing. Hashtag not all men.
Just the one that walked in the room.
Very good.
That one man just wandering around studios collecting publishing rights.
But it is about having, that pool of people, that kind of trusted ears.
Yes.
But knowing when to go to them and not constantly deferring to other people's judgment, and cultivating that sense of your own barometer of whether or not something is good. Otherwise, you do need to work with a producer.
Yes.
And not everyone's a producer, and that's okay. That's okay too. I think it's, again, one thing I learned from working with Mariam McNulty, and he came out on one of the tours that we were on in Australia. He was actually out there with Sterling Campbell, who also played with Bowie, and Sterling was playing drums with B-52s on that tour. And I had so many great chats with them just about kind of Bowie's ethic and the way that he works, and just this sense of, you do not have to do everything. if you are trying to engineer the record, produce the record and mix the record and write the songs and record all the parts, you are not going to make the best record. And Bowie did not do that. He understood that you needed to bring in the best people who were specialists in those particular areas, and that's not taking away from your autonomy as an artist.
Right.
And I that was a real revelation for me, to kind of have someone say that to me, that I did not need to sit there spending 12 hours editing the fucking drums on my own, and then just be able to say that I was the producer of the record. And although I did do that on about half the tracks on the album, it was really great to hear that from these guys that have got, you know, so much more experience than I have, and kind of basically say to me, do you know what, you don't have to do it all. Well, I was killing myself trying to do everything, thinking that was the only way that I deserved the credit, which is mad, right?
Well, yeah, it's kind of the idea of, like, in a way, I remember reading an interview with Grimes that was similar, where it's almost like this feeling of, like, that you have to do every single thing in order to prove that it's yours, in order to prove that you did it. And it's like, I'm so glad that someone validated that you actually don't. And also to encourage you to, like, trust others, that there are other people who specialize in this, and that's literally their job. and to trust them to do their job.
Well, it was hearing and being reminded that, you know, these big legendary producers like Tony Visconti, he's not saying they're editing his own fucking drums. You know,
Right.
Mario started out as his engineer, and, you know, he was editing his drums. And just being reminded that, you know, these big names, these guys, they're not doing that, because they don't,
Right.
I guess, have the same, you could either call it chip on your shoulder or insecurity about being undermined.
Right.
I think there's a lot of complex issues there, which are about, you know, sexist presumptions when women are involved in audio,
Yes.
our own perfectionism, our own ridiculous high standards, and our own sense of needing to prove ourselves with each other. But that's a whole other podcast.
I was like, this really should be called Why Not Everything, because that exactly what you were saying, that it's like, I feel like in a lot of ways the other female producers I know are in the same boat. That it's exactly what you're describing, that it's like, we have to then do it better. We have to do every single little thing to prove that, like, yes, we really are the producer.
And what I learned from making the second record is that what makes it better, what makes the best record, is getting the best mixers in. And why on earth would I think that I can mix a record better than Dave Aringa or Mario McNulty? Why? You know, I mean, that's just insane. And no one else would do that. So it's been a really great kind of learning process about being comfortable with myself, offloading tasks to other people, like any producer would, and that is what they do. So yeah, that's been now I feel like I kind of know how it works definitively. Until the next record, when I forget it all over again.
Well, and it's interesting also, given your artist name, because I mean, I might also be coming from the point of view of, like, an expired Jewish girl from the Valley. Not that I'm expired, just more the Judaism bit. That that I had to look up what an anchoress was, and I was fascinated by it. And it's interesting that now you're talking about almost kind of like less isolation, but is the concept of an anchoress, is that more well known in the UK, or if people asked about your name?
No, I don't think people have a bloody clue what it means. A lot of people think it's something to do with anchors and having a ship or something.
You're like, surprise!
But you're right, it's that kind of clever in-joke about that kind of monastic kind of lifestyle. You know, the anchoress was basically a kind of female proto-nun who would be bricked up and locked away, literally bricked into the side building of a church, where they would dedicate their life to worship and prayer and contemplation, and their only contact with the outside world would be through this tiny little kind of portal where food would be passed in and out, etc., and waste, etc. And for me, when I was making the first record, that felt like my life. It felt like a bit of a kind of apt metaphor for my creative process, and it is really interesting that it's evolved so much beyond that to be much more sociable.
Yeah, I was like, we don't have to brick you in. I just imagine taking a sledgehammer and being like, oh, come on out, it's okay.
Yeah, I'll have to change my name to something else.
The liberated anchoress, because when I looked them up, I did find that the practice to be fascinating.
Oh God, it's a rabbit hole you can really fall down, and I think for many women who are very kind of hyper focused on particular tasks, so there's a lot of resonance there for that kind of dedication to a single thing.
Right.
And I don't think you have to be religious to kind of find that to be something that resonates with you.
Well, and in a way also, like, I was thinking about when you said now that they were bricked in, that it's like that's the only way to make it so that then there weren't other obligations placed on them.
Exactly, yeah.
I
I mean, the other kind of draw for me was Julian of Norwich, who is one of the most famous anchoresses.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote the first sort of book in English, so she is like the very first one of the founders of literature in a way.
Wow.
in England as well. So that there was that kind of parallel with my kind of literary interests too, and her life is fascinating. If you ever get to sort of look up her story.
I was like, yes, another internet wormhole. Tell me more.
I really highly recommend it. And this manuscript was lost and preserved, and copies were made, and then this kind of group of women kind of ended up taking it over to France at one point, and then they thought it was lost. And it's an incredible story about the survival of this record of her time and her kind of divine revelations that she had, aka probably what we would now call some kind of form of psychosis.
Yeah, it was just like, basically this woman has been walled into a building, so I'm like, okay. That's
yeah, it might send you a little bit mad. So there's many levels in which, you know, people can kind of take away whatever they like from the name, but for me primarily it was just about putting a little distance between myself and my musical output. And again, you know, the title of the first record was partly about that too, that kind of mocking the idea that women can only write in the confessional mode. You know, the title of the first album, Confessions of a Romance Novelist. That collision of the fictive and the confessional is like, well, how can something be both true and fictional at the same time? And I like that idea, because I think that contradiction is at the heart of what I was writing for that album. It was about constructing these artificial confessions, these artificial cathartic moments. I didn't want people to know where the truth began and where the fiction ended.
And that, I think, that's one of the reasons I do love that album, by the way. And I love that cleverness about it, because similar things happen, and I'm sure they happen to other artists, but people have asked me, there's a song I'm releasing, probably, I like, knock wood, hopefully this year, because I'm working on the video for it. But the co-producer on it asked me, well, what inspired that song? Like, it's so sad. And I literally said to him, I saw a reflection of a cloud in a puddle. And he was like, what? He's like, you wrote the song about a puddle? I was like, well, not literally. The song's not about a puddle. Well, I mean, you could write a song about a puddle. But it's like, it spun this whole narrative in my head, seeing the image of the cloud reflected in it. And so it like, but it's like, is any of it true to life? I mean, probably there's elements of things that I felt about things that are in the song, but is it like a literal narrative of something? No. Like that's why you can write a song.
And I think that's quite a gendered assumption, isn't it? Often that women will write diaristically.
Yeah.
But also, I think I remember reading something Tori Amos said in an interview once about this, but that is denigrated in some way, that is an easier mode to write in somehow. Whereas I just think that you know, I think Shirley Manson from Garbage said this once, you know, to bleed really well into a song, you know, that's a great art. It's really hard to do well. And why should we? I think it's the same thing that we do in a lot of art forms, where particular modes or particular forms are more heavily associated with women, for instance, that we will then think of that as a lesser form of expression.
Right. Like, I think about why would a memoir necessarily be lesser if it was written by a woman than a man? Like, I was just thinking about the genres that are associated.
I mean, look at Anais Nin. I know we're both big fans of her.
Yes.
And the idea that she, you know, wasn't a proper writer because all of, you know, the majority of her published work is her diaries, and so we'll look at the quality of the writing, don't look at the form.
Well, and I was going to say, I remember when we first became friends talking about her writing, and not only the quality of it, but simply the way even, I think, just the way that she edited the narration of her own life and kind of crafted a narrative within her diaries that actually does hold narrative weight, which is fascinating because then she chose to live her life in a way that then she could write about it that would make a good story.
I mean, I know who I'd rather read out of Henry Miller or Niacin, so I mean, haven't even tried. I just can't do it. It does not. I don't get it. But
I keep trying. I read him in Big Sur to even try to get into, and I loved going to the Henry Miller Library in Big Sur, like the feeling of it. Like I love the feeling of what Henry was trying to get across, but yeah, Anais Nin far and away.
The version of Henry I like is the version that she writes about.
That's who I imagine, because clearly she loved him so well that it's like, of course I want to embrace the same person, but I think you're right that I like best her image of him.
Yeah, it's not reflected in the writing.
No.
Get these claws out.
Yep.
Or maybe it's just a testament to how blind love makes us.
Ouch. I was like, why would you come on my podcast and attack me like this?
I'm sorry to any Henry Miller fans out there. Niacin is quite obviously the superior writer.
Exactly. Well, and she also, I mean, she balanced a lot in her life as well that I think people underestimate.
Yeah, and I wonder again if it's very much something that women are sort of more prone to do. One, we're fantastic multitaskers.
Exactly.
But again, historically, culturally, the kind of domestic realm has always been something that's kind of fallen on women's shoulders too. So therefore necessitates an element of juggling if you're going to pursue a creative life as well.
Yes.
Be that as wife, mother, whatever, even if you firmly reject those roles in so many ways as she did, for instance, there's still elements of it that must be retained.
Right. Well, I remember, go on.
For financial, economic reasons, in her case, I guess if you want to be very mercenary about the situation, and that's tricky. But I do think I remember doing an article probably about 5 years ago for Elle magazine, I think it was, where they were chatting to what they were calling at the time slashers, which was their definition of people that juggled more than one career. And they were all women.
Of course.
I mean, again, I say this partly tongue-in-cheek for people that don't know me, but it's like, I'm not sure men are just very good at doing more than one thing. God, you know me, and you know I'm partly joking when I say this. I'm getting people going, God, she's such a misandrist. And it has been scientifically proven that all of this bollocks about women's brains being more attuned to multitasking is
of course
not borne out by any physiological differences in the brain.
No, it's all socialization that and then you end up through nurture.
So basically, men, you need to step it up and approve us all. And I'm sure there are countless examples of male artists that I'm just not aware of who are juggling many jobs, I'm sure.
I was speaking to a male sound engineer about this phenomenon. I was asking him about another realm in which I was just like, well, how can I teach men to do better? And he even said, he's just like, well, this generation might be lost, but the next generation you can prime. He's just like, by socializing men differently. He's I think
by that point we'll all by necessity, because of the gig economy, have about 5 jobs anyways. There will be no job security, so it'll just become normal to be juggling 5 or 6 things.
You'll just have to. I love, because even when I asked you what you did originally, when you were talking about going on tour, and then you were talking about being a studio musician, and then you spoke about doing your PhD, I love that you casually dropped, oh yeah, and when I wrote an article for Elle, I was just like, so you're also casually also a writer.
Oh no, I didn't write that article for Elle. I participated, but I do also do some journalism and writing as well. only not as often as I do the other things that I do, but I wrote a piece for the Independent recently about multiple miscarriage.
Wow.
That was something that I really wanted to write about. I've written for the Enemy occasionally. I think because I've got those skills that I've cultivated, obviously through my studies, people ask me to write things, even though I'm in no way qualified.
Except through your studies and your experience and your
No, but I mean, in terms of, I'm not a qualified journalist, and I always feel a bit bad about always reticent about taking work, writing work, because so many of my friends are journalists, and I don't want to take work away from those who are officially qualified.
Right.
But yeah, I have found myself doing bits of writing as well. I mean, I've done all sorts of extra things in between records. I've done things like consulted on social media, because obviously I've acquired these skills through running my own social media channels. So I've ended up working at some management companies, going in and doing days teaching their teams how to optimize their Facebook pages or how to use Twitter, etc. At one point I had a little kind of strange job doing some things for Chrissy Hind. This is before I joined Simple Minds, actually.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Helping her with some IT related things. I think I've just always been one of those people that's sort of turned their hand to things, and because I tend to get on well with people, and because I've got maybe it's kind of a teaching skill, I guess, the ability to explain things to people.
And that's quite valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it's applicable to lots of different realms of experience then, isn't it?
Right.
The weirdest job I ever had, though, was when I was still at university, and I was teaching elocution to 2 Russian pop stars. And that was a totally random job that I got offered through another manager. So there was quite a big management company in London, and they brought them over from Russia, where they were massive. And they were hoping to launch them in the UK. One was a more classical based artist, and another one was kind of like an emo sort of
God
type. And they were just both so intelligent, and I was just blown away by them. And I just was so impressed with them. And my job was to sit with them for 4 hours a week and help them with their kind of accent and elocution and just general kind of, I've done some really weird shit in my time.
And I think that's beautiful. Like when I'm confused when I speak to people that have only really done one thing. I'm just like, what's that like?
I would be so bored. I've never had a job, a normal job. I've never had a contract to do a normal job. I've been lucky so far in my life.
I worked very briefly at, it closed in America, but Borders bookstore. Like when I first graduated from college, I did work at Borders bookstore, and that was like, I think that's the closest I've had to like a normal job.
Oh, we would call that so I had a Saturday job when I was 16. I worked in a clothes store over here called Wallace, which is sort of a slightly high-end, or slightly more high-end, but high street store. And I did that every Saturday for 2 years. I guess, but it's not a 9-to-5 job, is it? It's not like a kind of Monday to Friday.
No. I had an internship with like a marketing company that was like a low-paid internship to see if I enjoyed marketing. And I believe I worked for them for 2 weeks before I was like,
My shortest ever job was with the BBC. I did, so I was about to start my master's, although I hadn't heard back about whether or not I'd got funding for it. So I was offered an internship at the BBC as a researcher working on one of their programs. It was an arts program, so it suited me really well. I'd done a bit of TV at my university during my first degree. So I was lucky enough to get onto the program, which is really prestigious and everybody wants to do it. And I lasted, I think, one day, it might have been 1.5 days, before I thought, this is not for me at all. I was very unlucky with the person that was supervising me. He was, I think now they would call it workplace bullying. It was really awful. And then I found out that I'd got the funding that week for my master's, and I just sent them an email and was just like, do you know what, this isn't right for me, and I've just found out I've got funding, so I'm not going to be able to carry on over the summer. So yeah.
Right.
My mum was pretty furious with me because we come from a family like mine that's really working class. The idea that you get a job at the BBC is like incredible, you know. It would be the
right, and then be like, JK, no,
and I'm like, yeah, just walked out of the BBC after like, less than 48 hours.
I knew there was a reason we were friends.
But I knew that it wasn't for me, and I wasn't going to be able to maintain that. Not punching this person in the face. It was horrendous, you know. There is everyone has a breaking point, and
yes,
that was going to be my breaking point.
I love that you recognized it early on. You're like, nope. And also
the fluorescent lighting in the office was just horrendous. It gave me really bad migraines, and
yes,
yeah, I couldn't work in an office. I just couldn't do it.
That was honestly, for me, that was the worst part of my graduate degree, was that the classrooms had fluorescent lighting.
I don't think people really realize how much your sensory environment is so important to what you can actually manage.
Yes.
I'm certain that a lot of people that end up with these kind of multiple careers, juggling multiple roles, there are other reasons like behind that why perhaps you don't put yourself into an environment that is repetitive or sensorially straining, etc. And certainly over the years I look back now and think, there's a reason why I did my master's and PhD, because I'm really not great at interacting with people in group situations. And you can look back and reflect on the choices that you made that actually haven't been very intuitively right for your weaknesses. But at the time not consciously realizing that.
Yes, and being in tune with yourself, at least to know that it's the right or wrong decision for you. But then looking back, I like what you said, like looking back and thinking, well, why did I do that? Which it seems obvious in retrospect that I'm like, well, I have ADHD and delayed sleep phase disorder. So of course I have sensory issues and I'm not going to be really good with a regular schedule. Like, of course I would choose jobs that are more in tune with that.
Yeah, whereas you wouldn't consciously have set up thinking, I'm going to have a freelance career because of this.
Exactly. It's like, no, I definitely chose this to play to my strengths instead of if I had to try and interact with people repeatedly at an office in fluorescent lighting.
And perhaps that's why a lot of creative people are drawn to those kind of freelancing careers as well, because it's something about the way our brains work differently.
Yes, and that also having the courage to speak to that, of, you know, because I can imagine turning down that BBC job after one day. There must have been a part of you that was like, oh, what am I doing? And then the other part of you is like, I must do this.
I think I've just always been really aware of my limits, what I can and can't do, what is feasible for me. I think, you know, being diagnosed with autism fairly young, I was always very just aware of my strengths in a very positive way, but also just what was an absolutely no-go for me. But not to see it as a negative thing, to just focus on the strengths instead. And I've been supremely lucky to have been aware of that from so early. I think that I was able to tailor my path to that, you know, and I'm the first person in my family to go to university.
Wow.
Not as if there is any precedent for any of this, but it was totally the right path for me because of the things that I have difficulty with. And I don't talk, I think, I'm not actually sure I've ever spoken publicly about this before. I think it would be fairly obvious to anybody else who has ASD that they meet me, but I just feel you know, that's not at the forefront of the decisions that I've made, but it has intuitively informed the pathways that I've taken, but in a really positive way.
Right. I love that you spoke to it as identifying your strengths within it, because, and also I'm so grateful that you did receive a diagnosis, because I feel like diagnoses give people power, is what I've always thought about them, because if you don't know what's happening, you can't always make informed choices for yourself, even as a kid.
Well, exactly. For me, it just really stopped me blaming myself for the things that I was less good at.
Right.
And meant that I could explain to people why, for instance, they thought I was being rude, or why they were misinterpreting how I was acting, or why I really loved single focused tasks. But having that, arming yourself with that knowledge as early on as possible enables you to then tailor a path through life that speaks to those strengths. And and I know not everybody is lucky, obviously, enough to be high functioning with that. And yes, at times there have been things that have been massively debilitating for me, but I just try and avoid those situations that I know will create ultimately that meltdown or stress.
Right.
So far, I've been able to do that so far. I say that tentatively.
And in a way, it's so that then you can, one, so that you can feel content and comfortable, and also so that you can maximize what you actually want to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started at uni, I was signed up for 1 degree, and by the end of the first term, I was doing 2, because I knew that I would be bored shitless doing 1. And I knew that what was right for me was to max out my time, because I need to be occupied. And a big red flag for me is being bored. I can't be bored, and I can't have too much free time.
Right.
It doesn't work for me. And no, I knew that. And while someone else looks at my schedule and thinks, my God, you're insane, like that's too much for one person to do, for me, my personal experience with over scheduling is that works for me.
And it sounds like balancing having a busy schedule with also caring for yourself, as you said, like it sounds like almost when you were describing like the Mannix tour with then your other touring with your studio, that sounded like it was almost like too much, that then it was too hard on your body, but having like figuring out that threshold of like just enough.
I think the difference there was perhaps the physical toll that it took.
Yeah.
I hadn't really had that factored into a situation before where there was physical intolerance or mental kind of strains. So, and I think also the difference was the social interaction side of things. Obviously, touring is not a solitary. It's not a solitary. What's the word I'm looking for? Pursuit. There is a lot of interaction, maybe with people that you don't know. So I think that's a new element that I hadn't encountered so much. I think just the physical and mental fatigue then perhaps changes your tolerance levels of other things.
Right.
Too. And ultimately for me as an individual, that's probably not sustainable over a 5-10 year period.
No, because then I can imagine then you'd have to kind of like put energy into like socially masking and then interacting and then all the travel and all of that. I was like, oh, that sounds exhausting.
I got very good at finding the prayer room in airports, etc.
You are the Anchoress. I love it.
So it's just finding those moments to be alone.
Yes.
And not having the constant, the social interaction, I think for me is the hardest thing. When it's not one-on-one, that can be quite exhausting.
Yes.
But I hadn't had to encounter that too much in my life before, so that was a big lesson for me to learn.
And you're like, wait a second.
Why do I feel so exhausted all the time?
Oh, wait, I'm having to put all this energy into this thing that drains me.
Yes, we live, we learn.
Well, what advice would you give to musicians who are starting out now or other producers who are starting out now?
Get a PhD.
I mean, same, but
have something not to fall back on, not like a plan B, but have another skill set, so that you're making decisions about the projects that you work on and the things that you're saying yes to because they're right for you creatively, ethically, or they serve you creatively, they serve you in terms of growth, and not because you need the money.
I love that.
That was the best piece of advice someone ever gave to me, was you ask yourself 4 questions about a project. Does it benefit me financially? Does it benefit me in terms of my creative growth? Does it introduce me to a new circle of people or a different experience I haven't had before? I can't remember what the 4th one was, but it was basically, does it fit any of these criteria? But if it doesn't, then you can say no to things. And
I do think that's valuable, the power of being able to know that you can say no.
Yeah, I think there's a big scrambling to say yes to everything now because people are so worried about losing an opportunity, but it's about taking the right opportunities.
I love that, of having, and I love how you framed it as that it's not something to fall back on, because it sounds like your work on your PhD has actually fostered a lot of your work outside of that.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's led to this really quite incredible situation right now where I'm having to only work 1 day a week on this master's program, and that it kind of feeds both financially and creatively my music work. And that's something I understand how privileged I am to do that, but I worked my arse off to put myself in that position.
Right. I was gonna say, like, it's a privilege, and it's also something you earned, because it doesn't sound like you just kind of fell into it.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I was consciously understanding that is what the position I would end up in. But equally, I know a lot of musicians that aren't in my position because they don't have that academic qualification that's
right.
Obviously people want, if they're going to invite you to kind of teach at their institution. So it's yeah. It's not a fallback plan, it's a parallel path, is what I would say.
I love that. I was like, that's the note I want to end on, to have parallel paths, because that is, and in a way I was just like, oh, they're parallel, but Catherine, sometimes they're perpendicular because they meet. sometimes it's few paths
together in like one big smoothie.
Have a smoothie of paths. You heard it here first.
Can't believe I'm giving career advice as food metaphors. And do have a smoothie as well if you're touring, because it will stop you getting sick.
Yes. Oh my gosh. The last I was traveling, there are these really delightful, like, smashed orange and ginger smoothies that I found in the airport that are, bless them.
I'd never encountered a NutriBullet. Do you have NutriBullet over there?
We do.
So I'd never encountered a NutriBullet until I toured, and by the end of it, I was mushing up like whole chunks of ginger, like sunflower, pumpkin. It was basically like my medicine. It was basically disgusting, but it was like taking kind of like a medicine shot every day. Shaving off all of these kind of germs that you're encountering.
Yeah, so it's like the NutriBullet, and also like the portable humidifiers are pretty great too.
Oh my god, we could do a whole podcast about my love of humidifiers.
Well, we'll have to revisit in the next few years, be like, what are you up to? Tell me more about what you've discovered about humidifiers.
That's my other top tip for touring, is always have humidity. Even if people think you're crazy with your 3 humidifiers in your hotel room, and you're not Mariah Carey.
I love that. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both? If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com, and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.